Good morning, and thank you for joining American Farmland Trust's rollout of our Project Prioritization Tool, a tool anticipated to advance the protection of farmland and natural resources in the San Joaquin Valley. AFT has been working on this update for the past several months and is pleased to bring this tool to you to hopefully aid in the work that you and your colleagues are doing in the San Joaquin Valley. Samuel, can we switch slides? Excellent. The voice coming from on high is Katie Patterson, the California Policy Manager. I'd like to first take a moment and acknowledge the rest of the AFT staff who've worked hard to pull this together. Our Regional Director, Kara Heckert, AFT Program Assistant, Samuel Madrigal, AFT Communications Manager, Teresa O'Connor, and our former colleague, Justin Bodell, who worked as a project manager on the development of the PPT. There are numerous national staffers that also worked on this for the California team to support the rollout of this webinar as well. So thank you to all. Next, I'd also like to highlight and thank Conservation Biology Institute, which Justin Bryce is joining us today later in our questions and answers section, and NRCS, who without their support and technical expertise, this would not be possible. Today's session will be structured a little differently. We're going to do this rollout using a hybrid approach. First, we'll play a video in which we will invoke our former colleague, Justin Bodell, and walk through a video demonstration of the PPT in action. After this 40-minute demo, we'll come back live to answer any questions participants may have. As you have questions, please feel free to send them using the question and answer feature on the GoToWebinar dashboard. AFT staff will be monitoring these during the course of the webinar, and we'll work to answer as many questions as we can. All technical questions related to the webinar may also be submitted through the dashboard. So if you're having trouble hearing, seeing the screen, or the video, please let us know via the questions panel. At this time, we will transition into the pre-recorded demonstration of the PPT. Samuel, would you please start the video? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Project Prioritization Tool demonstration. I'm Justin Bodell. I'm the California Conservation and Stewardship Program Manager, and I'm joined here with Katie Patterson, who is our State Policy Manager, and Samuel Madrigal, who is our Program Assistant. I'm going to give a little bit of background about the history of this project and then dive right into the actual tool itself, which you can see on your screen. And go through a couple scenarios which will demonstrate how we use this tool. But I'm going to start off here with a little bit of background on our San Joaquin land and water strategy. A couple years ago, it's summer of 2018, AFT released a report that looked at the nexus of water resources and agricultural land quality and development threat, as well as some other factors influencing the future of farming in the San Joaquin Valley. And this was the California director, Kara Heckert, her predecessor, Ed Thompson, worked with Conservation Biology Institute, who is still our partner on this, to develop a series of maps that are in this report, and we can provide links to this report. But they used this the database and platform to create this mapping tool, which provided the maps and all the data in this San Joaquin land water strategy. And you know, the basic analysis showed that we're developing on our most productive, resilient, and versatile farmland that also has really good groundwater recharge potential. So with this report, we hope to highlight the importance of protecting our best farmland around the cities in the San Joaquin Valley, particularly with SGMA coming along, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act that's coming along. We're going to see so many land use shifts over the next couple decades, and we're hopeful that this report and the tool that I'll be demonstrating will be helpful in prioritizing land that we should be protecting, or prioritizing areas that would be better to be developed on, or looking at the best places for transitioning to other less water intensive types of agriculture. So
Justin, I'll add a plug in here for the San Joaquin Valley water strategy. For folks that want to get to it a little bit faster, you could Google it on our Farmland Information Center. If you Google Farmland Information Center, you can search for the San Joaquin Land Water Strategy Report, along with a whole number of other publications that California and the rest of the AFT family have produced.
Right on. Thanks, Katie. I want to give just a real quick introduction to Data Basin. This is a platform that was created by Conservation Biology Institute, and it's a free online cloud-based spatial data library. It's a really powerful tool. It allows for collaborative problem solving and support for learning, research, sustainable environmental stewardship. What's really great about it is, well, first of all, it's free and available to the public. Most of the data on here is open source, and anyone can view it. There are some private data that not everyone can see, but what's really great about this is anyone can go on and explore the different gateways that have collections of different data. If you sign up for a free account, you can create maps and share those maps either publicly or privately amongst the people that you're working with. So it's a really powerful tool, and I found it to be extremely useful for quickly vetting potential projects. What's really great about it is the modular nature of it. This project prioritization tool is not something that you can enter your criteria into and it crunches that criteria through an algorithm and it spits out exactly what you're looking for. This is, again, it's a modular platform where you can import different layers, and through an iterative process that I'll show in just a moment here, start to identify at a higher level the areas or even the specific parcels that might be good for whatever particular project you're interested in. So with that, I think I'll go right into this San Joaquin Valley Project Prioritization Tool. This is the landing page that has a short summary, and then if you scroll down, these are all the different data these are the different layers that are in this startup map. You can look at those each individually, but they are in this startup map that I'll get to in just a second. And then there's also other data available here that I'll go into again in a little bit later in the presentation. There's also documents here. There are some related documents that will be useful, and we will have a manual that essentially describes what I'm talking about here today, provides context for the tool, and then provides a little more depth as far as the different tools within our project prioritization tool, and also provides some context and history. So that we're working on that. That will be available soon if it's not available now. So let me jump right into this startup map of the project prioritization tool. So again, what I'd like to do is go through a few scenarios of potential uses for this tool. So what I'll do is I'll start off on something that AFT would use it for, or a different land trust would use it for, or possibly a GSA. Groundwater Sustainability Agency. So I'm going to zoom into the city of Madera here and turn on a few layers here. The first one's already on. This is the Farmland Mapping and Monitoring Program. And I mentioned before that we wanted to, it's going to be important moving forward to protect our most valuable farmland. So what we did here was have the prime farmland layer turned on so that we could identify potential projects that have prime farmland. And the point being, we want to protect those areas. And if there is going to be development, then ideally it would be on areas that are not prime farmland, if at all possible. So the next one to turn on in relation to that is this high development threat level. Sometimes these take a minute to load, but there it is. Let me zoom back out and you can see a little bit more of the valley. But these areas in red are either city limits, spheres of influence, or designated in a general plan for development. What we found in our analysis in the San Joaquin Land and Water Strategy report was that right now there are more acres of farmland projected to be developed than is actually needed, even with low density development. So what is happening in essence is that by virtue of these larger spheres of influence, lower density development is possibly tacitly being encouraged. And AFT certainly wants to encourage higher density development. So this red area shows areas within a sphere of influence around Madera. So if possible, we want to protect areas that are likely to be developed. So that's one of the layers that I'll turn on here. Then the other one, I'm just going to take a little side thought here. We all know that Sigma is going to result in really massive land use changes. And there are a lot of options on the table as far as increasing groundwater recharge and decreasing extraction of groundwater. And I'll talk about both of those in the course of this presentation. But what I want to mention here is the opportunity for groundwater recharge. So the UC Davis a few years ago came out with some really great data that has been updated. Well, I think there's actually some new data that is, it's either released or it's about to be released for the, it's called the SAGB data. Let me find it here. Soil Agricultural Groundwater Banking Index. So what UC Davis did was looked at a number of different criteria and determined which areas have high potential for groundwater recharge. And this is, it's not something that you can, the data is of course very good, but it's not something that you could use to develop a project completely. This is just sort of a high level analysis of areas that are likely to have good groundwater recharge potential. To actually do a groundwater recharge project, obviously there's a lot of in-depth site analysis and soil analysis, that type of thing, to make sure it is truly appropriate. But this data is really helpful in quickly vetting the potential for projects. So I'm going to turn off this high development threat layer. Actually, real quick, I might demonstrate this swiper tool. This is a really handy tool when you have a lot of different layers on here. I could have, right now, I think I have 3 different layers on, and you can manipulate this bar over here on the left in the layers legend here and decide which layers you want on either side of this swiper bar. So it comes in really handy for kind of being able to see through some complex data. The other thing that's really handy is the transparency function. I'll just turn that on real quick. I can increase or decrease the transparency of the data so that I can see through different layers that are on top of each other. If any of you all are familiar with GIS, it has a lot of similar functionalities, GIS, but a lot of the hard work has already been done. So it's a little more intuitive and user-friendly than GIS. But let me keep going on that SAGB data. So right now we're looking here at areas that are potentially going to be developed, that are prime farmland, and that have high groundwater recharge potential. I'm going to turn off a couple of these to make it a little bit clearer. The other relevant layer to this discussion is the Cropscape layer that USDA provides. And what we did was they sort of just provide one map with all the different crops. What we did was we pulled out each individual crop. I think this is the top 10 or 15 in the San Joaquin Valley, and increased the functionality so you could turn on and off individual crops. So you could kind of zoom in on the specific crop you're looking at. In this case, it would be grapes. We know from some really great projects down in Fresno County that grapes are a good crop for a practice known as flood-mar, or flood-managed aquifer recharge. There's another term you might hear, ag-mar, ag-managed aquifer recharge. And flood-mar refers to a suite of different practices where essentially stormwater that is not otherwise being used can be spread out onto farm fields to recharge the aquifer. So flood-mar is one of those practices, is flooding the farm fields, and that specific practice is sometimes referred to as ag-mar. So what we did here was, knowing that grapes are a really good crop for that type of project, what we did, we can turn on the grape layers. So now we're looking at prime farmland that has good groundwater recharge potential, that's could likely be developed, and that is also growing grapes. So these are a bunch. Again, I mentioned this was an iterative process. So what we're doing is zooming in on potential properties that might be good candidates either for a conservation easement that would protect the farm from development, or or a agmar or flood-mar type groundwater recharge project.
Justin,
yeah, please go ahead.
I'd like to just, acknowledge, when we look at the city, boundaries here, and being able to see the imagery where these things all connect, and I just believe that gives and lends itself to greater partnerships, with communities, and understanding what the resources are, both natural and agricultural, to their communities, and where there may be partnerships in addressing issues like the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act implementation, and or really looking at developing strong agricultural policies that embrace agricultural protection of the highest value within their communities. One thing that a lot of people do not know is that LAFCOs that help build these spheres of influence can actually go back with communities and look at redrawing their lines. If the community values now are able to address and see some more of these opportunity areas, it may be prime for folks to take a look and see if they still meet up with now this new information. So a simplified GIS platform here, being a policy person, I think is very handy to lend itself to these conversations with planners, community level folks, folks in the ag industry, etc. So I just wanted to make that little transition there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for mentioning that, Katie. I'm hopeful that this tool, like you mentioned, will be useful to a number of different organizations and agencies, from land trusts to GSAs to municipal planning offices, LAFCOs, like you mentioned. And I think that it's important to mention that these types of projects are not done in a bubble or in a vacuum. They really do require a lot of different partnerships. For example, this scenario that I'm laying out here would require coordinating with Madera Irrigation District. And in fact, they are doing some really great work already on this floodmar or agmar type of groundwater recharge projects. Sustainable Conservation is working with them, and they really are doing some great work and have been for the past, gosh, 5 or 10 at least years. So there's definitely a lot of potential for collaboration with water districts, and actually that's a really good transition to this next layer. I'm going to turn off a couple of these layers to make things a little clearer. I'm going to turn on this California Water Districts layer. So we know, and you can see this is all Madera Irrigation District. So you can see in a lot of, particularly the northern San Joaquin Valley, water districts do have surface water availability, and some of them may have the water rights to use that in a recharge capacity. There's obviously a lot of details that need to be worked out here, but this layer here, California Water Districts, takes away any uncertainty about which water district you may be in, and then it's a quick phone call or some research to find out what kind of potential there might be for those types of projects. So I'm going to keep moving along here. Let me just see here. Just one other point on this this scenario is, let me just turn off this the grapes layer here and turn on one last layer, the California Conservation Easement Database. So this is these are conservation easements that are held by American Farmland Trust. And the reason I want to highlight this is just to this has been a good success story in slowing down the growth of Madera to the west. In fact, there are developments butted up right against active productive farmland, which is really what we want to see, and higher density development butted up against the farmland. So this is a success story, certainly, but the other point is that funding for these particularly conservation easement projects, and I am going to talk about other projects beside conservation easements in just a minute, but funding for those types of projects is more likely if they're close to development and contribute to a green belt or community spacers. So this could be important information depending on the type of funding you're looking for. But I'm going to keep moving on into a different scenario. This is really talking about Sigma and land use changes. So I mentioned the water districts layer. The inverse of water districts layer is the areas without water districts. Right here, it's showing as green, but they are colloquially known as white areas.
Hey, Justin?
Yeah, go ahead, Samuel.
Sorry about that. But before you get into this scenario here, I think there's one more point to the last scenario with the demo map that we made that maybe we need to get into.
Yeah, thank you for reminding me, Samuel. Just real quick, I asked Samuel to looking at all the different criteria, and again, this is sort of a hypothetical scenario, but look at all the different criteria and pick some farms that meet that criteria. Prime farmland, high groundwater recharge potential, they're maybe developed, and they're growing grapes. So what Samuel was able to do is upload the parcel data, select these parcels, and then create a map. And you can actually turn these layers on and off. They are up here, so I can turn these layers off and manipulate the data that Samuel created. And then I could also, again, this is a separate map that Samuel created. I can share this. Samuel sent it to me. I can share it with other people. I can make it public or private. That's just some of the functionality of the platform. Thanks, Samuel, for reminding me, because I think that's an important point. Let me go back to, where was I? I lost. Okay, here we are. So I was talking about the white areas. We know from a lot of work that the Public Policy Institute of California has been doing, analyzing the impacts of Sigma, that there over the next 20 years, there's going to be some really big shifts in land use. They're projecting anywhere from 500,000 to over 1 million acres of currently irrigated farmland may be taken out of irrigation anyway. So what I want to talk about here is the potential for transition to less water intensive agriculture. I talked about GSAs and how there are a number of different scenarios to implement SGMA. They basically fall into two categories: reduce the amount of water that's pumped or increase the amount of water that goes into the ground. I talked about the groundwater recharge. Unfortunately, the white areas are solely reliant on groundwater, and they are going to be hit the hardest with groundwater pumping restrictions. So that is where we are likely to see a lot of the land use changes. And at AFT, we want to support agriculture as much as possible. So if there's any way to transition from fully irrigated agriculture to less water intensive agriculture, we support that, and we really want to make that happen, because the alternative is pretty grim. If there are if the farms are no longer viable, there's a lot of bad repercussions to that. So this scenario would be if a GSA were looking at ways to reduce the amount of groundwater that's being pumped. So this is Western Madera, this white area. I'm going to turn on a couple other layers here. The areas without water districts is turned on, and I'm going to turn on this FMMP layer, but I'm going to turn off the prime farmland and turn on the grazing layer. So right now we're looking at the areas without water districts and areas that are currently grazed. And then finally, I'm going to turn off the grapes here and turn on alfalfa. So if I turn on that layer, so what we're looking at here is areas that are currently grazed, white areas, or light green is this color, as this layer is colored right now, and the pink is alfalfa. So if we zoom in a little bit, and again, this is, I'm not pointing out any specific parcels, this is just sort of a demonstration of one analysis that could be done with this tool. If I see areas that are irrigated, this alfalfa, or we could even turn on grapes also, or almonds. There's certainly plenty of almonds around here. But what this is we're looking at areas that are currently irrigated that will likely face some pumping restrictions in the future, and that will precipitate a change in the way that area is farmed. Knowing that there is grazing going on in these areas, and knowing that there is irrigated farming going on in these areas, the farms that are adjacent to grazing may have a good, the infrastructure and contracts may be in place so that area that's currently being grown for alfalfa could transition into grazing. So that's the type of land use changes that we expect to be seeing. There will certainly be some sort of groundwater credit trading that will happen, that will influence the patterns of these land use changes. But this is just an example of one way a GSA, for example, could prioritize their outreach to folks in the white areas who may be facing restrictions. They may be saying, hey, you might be a good candidate for transition to a less water intensive form of agriculture. The other scenario that I want to get into, it's similar to this in that it's focusing on the white areas, but the other potential that certainly a lot of people have seen with the projected land use changes with SGMA is a transition to native habitat. So I'm going to turn off these layers just for a moment and go up into Merced County. And up near the Merced National Wildlife Refuge. So I'm going to turn the areas without water districts back on, and I'm going to turn on, the grazing is already on, turn the alfalfa back on, and the California Protected Area Database. So this is different from the conservation easement database that I showed before, but let me just turn that on right there. So a lot of data here, but if I start to zoom in around the Merced National Wildlife Refuge, let me use this swiper tool to clear up a little bit of that confusion here. Let me just pull that down there. So here's the Merced National Wildlife Refuge. There's certainly irrigation going on around here, and there is certainly plenty of grazing that's going on around here. In fact, this is a pretty good time for me to turn on or show you the information identify tool. So I can click on that and click on a location, and I can see that it shows it's grazing, it's alfalfa, and it is, if I, it's in the Grasslands Wildlife Management Area. Pretty sure that's the Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So a lot of these areas around the National Wildlife Refuges have conservation easements that protect them from development, and they are essentially used for wildlife habitat. They're grazed, but the grazing, as we all know, grazing is a really critical tool in managing native habitat, particularly this grasslands habitat. So we think there's a fair potential for bringing in funding for restoration to native habitat from some of the natural resource agencies like Fish and Wildlife Service or DFW or Wildlife Conservation Board, or private nonprofits like TNC or EDF. I think there's a lot of potential there. But this tool, again, could be used to really quickly identify potential projects. I'm going to skip ahead real quick to some work that TNC did that we included, and they were gracious enough to let us put this data on our tool. But what they did was they looked at potential habitat for 2 or more target species. So they did this, they released this, I think it was last summer, they released this report, and actually it is available it is available right here. The TNC report is. But I think there is a lot of potential for transition to native habitat, particularly in areas that are adjacent to grazing already, and ones that are either adjacent or very close to existing wildlife refuges or areas that are wildlife areas that are managed through grazing. So, a lot of the thought that we a lot of the thoughts that we had going into this is that we want to bring in as much funding as possible into the San Joaquin Valley. There's going to be a pretty big economic hit from SGMA, and these are some ways some ways to bring in funding, either for conservation easements or for transition to native habitat. One real quick mention, AFT was recently awarded a grant from the Natural Resources Conservation Service called a Regional Conservation Partnership Program, and that will bring money into the valley for conservation practices such as irrigation efficiency upgrades, potentially for flood-mar or ag-mar type recharge projects, and then also some funding for conservation easements. So we really think it's important for everyone to work together toward the same goal, and bringing in some public funding is going to be critical. And we're hopeful that this tool will help support the cases for bringing in public funding. The last scenario that I want to talk about here is the, let me turn off all these other layers real quick. Leave that one on, that one's important. Turn off these other ones. But maybe, I think it was about 5 years ago, California said to actually Conservation Biology Institute, they said, hey, let's do a project to find out the best places to do solar energy fields. So what they did was they directed, they got environmentalist groups together and farmers and solar energy developers, and they said, okay, you all go your separate ways, go your separate ways, figure out where the best location that you think is for solar energy. And after that work was done, they came back together and they merged all of the drawings and all of the maps to find out the areas that are the least conflict for, sorry, I'm trying to turn off this one layer. There it is. The areas that are in least conflict among all of the different partners. And that's the last layer. Well, I don't want to drag on here too long, but I do want to show this one. This is the least conflict composite area, which is the composite of all the different groups coming together and deciding where specifically would be an area that would be good for essentially all parties to have solar development. And you can see this dark green over here is the priority areas. It's really, a lot of it's up in the hills, and then there's a fair amount of it in the valley. Sorry, I think I may need to reload that data, but let me just zoom in here because we were talking about the Merced National Wildlife Refuge. Again, those white areas are going to be facing some pretty severe restrictions on pumping, and some water credit trading scenarios that we've seen have talked about having the ability to transfer groundwater pumping rights from one parcel to another, essentially, consolidating where that water is applied, so that at least some parcels still remain able to be fully watered. Some of the other areas, if that type of scenario comes to pass, some of the other areas that are not going to be watered at all, like I mentioned before, could be transitioned to grazing or dryland farming, or they could be developed into solar energy fields. And this work that was done a few years ago, I think, would be really helpful for GSAs in particular in having a discussion with the individual landowners about what their options are. So this data, I think, will be helpful for that. One last couple of layers that I just want to turn on real quick related to this area is the terrestrial connectivity. This is data from Department of Fish and Wildlife. And again, this gets back to supporting the case for bringing in some public funding for conservation easements. This is work that DFW did that looked at the connectivity of natural areas. And I think this can, again, this is really just for high level planning, but it can lead to thoughts about potential transition to native habitat, and then support some applications for funding. So, and then the last one is just the terrestrial biodiversity that is included in here as well. So these layers are the ones that we thought would be most effective or most useful to the most number of organizations. But I do want to point out, I mentioned earlier that this is a modular system. What is really great about Basin is just the vast amount of data that's in here and publicly available. This is just one of the galleries that I opened up related to that least conflict solar project. So this is the information that was gathered specifically about solar energy. For example, they have they have transmission line locations and geothermal wells and oil and gas wells, utility corridors. Again, all of this is publicly available, but depending on what you're interested in, you can upload this information into a map and create a map depending on exactly what criteria you're looking for. The other one is the that I just want to highlight is the environmental conservation. Lots and lots of information about in here about protected areas, protected species. It really gets, you can really kind of get lost in all of the different data that's here. But again, it's a modular system that you can use to customize maps that will help you identify what potential projects there are. And I think that's about it. I just want to check in with Katie and Samuel. Let me get back to this page here. Just want to check in with Katie and Samuel to make sure I didn't miss anything. But that is the, go ahead, Katie or Samuel.
Yeah, so thank you so much for taking us through that tool, Justin. I'm gonna reset my mic here because I was getting some feedback. So I wanted to definitely touch on that point of, the way that the tool is modular in nature, and also how it's built into a platform that allows for that collaboration, both internally and externally. The functionality of having your own private working space too, so that it kind of takes the pressure off of, what if scenarios, I think is really important. But the idea that this can expand collaboration again to a broader audience of folks, and as a land trust, we see it pretty handy for the work that we're doing in the San Joaquin Valley, and we've had some pretty positive feedback on this from a number of partners, some that Justin have mentioned and some that we haven't mentioned yet, but that really, work in this space and have seen a lot of tools, things that are using different metrics in the background and algorithms, and because this is more humble in nature, without its own algorithm, it's a very factually or factual approach to how we're looking at data, but it gives such a broad cross-section of utilization for folks to play with the tool, learn the tool, and really ask questions within their own community around their own priorities. And not only AFTs that we've shared with you, but within your own communities to highlight, what could be explored even further, or maybe even to look at future research, options, or look at where there may need to be more funding because there's a higher potential for projects. So I just really want to drive that point home, that the flexibility and utilization of this tool across multiple levels of professionals, public, private sector, in our communities. It's a valuable piece that we hope to see expanded beyond the San Joaquin Valley, perhaps even statewide. And we've actually heard from others that have asked, is this available nationally, which it is not at this point, that we would be happy to have that funded to be a national tool.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Katie. I think those are definitely some excellent points. And one of the things that I really like about this is it's intuitive and pretty user-friendly. If anyone has any experience with GIS, this will be, a walk in the park. And for everyone else, it's really pretty easy to play around with and turn different layers on and off and change the transparency and change the layers, based on, and you can even change the colors. If a white is definitely not a good choice of color for the white areas. It'll be a little hard to see, but I can change the colors of the different layers. So there's similar functionality as GIS, but it's a lot more user friendly. So I just want to wrap things up here by saying thank you all for listening, and we're hopeful that this will be a useful tool, and to please reach out to us if you have any any questions, Conservation Biology Institute and AFT will be available to talk to you about using the tool and troubleshooting and any kind of support. We're certainly there because we want to see this tool get used as much as possible. So again, thank you very much.
Okay, while we bring this webinar back to live, we will just wait for a minute for our slide to pop back up. And hopefully you all are seeing this. We are going to shift over into the question and answers portion. So again, thank you for your attention during the training video. We will be making the recording of this webinar available online after the session, and we'll send out the link for the training and the associated startup guide and the manual to the PPT for quick reference. We'll also be providing an AFT contact for any additional questions you may have. Just as Justin had mentioned, Samuel Madrigal will be our point of contact on this, and we can definitely make connections to CBI if you have some more in-depth questions to discuss as you become more familiarized with the tool. We do have some time left for questions, and at this point in time, I see that we have no questions. So I will give us just another minute or two just to see if anyone wants to post any questions here. And with me to help field those are our Regional Director, Kara Heckert, and AFT's Program Assistant, Samuel Madrigal, and Justin Bryce from CBI. So we'll just give folks a minute here to see if there's anything else that's lingering out there. And there's potential that you won't have questions just because this is a new tool, and the questions may come as you start to familiarize yourself and actually get into Basin and start playing with the scenarios. And we certainly want to make sure that you all know that we are here to answer those questions at that time. We'll give it that nice long awkward pause. Okay. Let's see. Okay, we do have a question here from Mr. David Dodds over at Department of Conservation, and he was asking about how the development pressure layer was developed. And we're going to go and unmute Justin Bryce and allow him to help answer this question, because my understanding from it was that this is a layer that was taken from the CNRA database. And so perhaps he can share a little bit more insights on that. Justin, you should be unmuted.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah, you are correct. It actually was a layer that was developed in the land water strategy work that was done, I believe, in 2016 with the previous CBI employee, Dustin Pierce. And if you want to learn more about those data sets within that startup map, if you go to the details, each data set has a data set homepage that kind of describes the data set, the source, the year, kind of some metadata behind it. So I'd recommend checking that out. And the one that is used in the Project Prioritization Tool is just the high threat development layer. There were two other medium and low that were included in the original, but Justin Bodell and myself agreed that the higher one was more robust, I guess, in terms of where the data were coming from. So we felt confident in using that one. But yeah, within that startup map, if you look at the data sets on the left-hand side and hit the little play button and then click on the details, it'll pop up a little page. And if you click on the the title of that data set, it'll take you to a separate page specifically to that data set.
Great. And that's true for all of the data, right, Justin? In terms of, you know, being able to go through and see the origins for the original data or the reports, you know, that support the data sets that were pulled in.
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah. Any of the data
Great.
sets here in the map. And
Right.
please feel
So
free
if
to email
folks,
me if you have any questions.
great. Thank you for that. And so folks can go back and think about when Justin Bodell was mentioning like the TNC solar data, you know, where we had that exercise and we just kind of talk about where we store some of those data pieces. It'll take a little bit of time, I think, you know, as people start familiarizing themselves with the different layers, and also if they bring in their own layers, you know, to work in some of these workspaces. So excellent. Thank you both for the question and answer. All right, I do not see any more questions here. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and run to our final remarks here. And Samuel, can we advance that slide? Thank you. Okay, so I do want you all to take note that we have the link to the Project Prioritization Tool webpage on AFT's or hosted on AFT's website. And from there, you can see the quick start guide, the manual, and be linked over to the original reports and the PPT tool itself. In the next couple of days, we will be sending you out an email that will include the webinar information and Samuel's contact information. And we could also work to connect you with Justin Bryce as well if you have additional questions on the PPT or any of the other data basin components. In the meantime, I would say thank you so much for joining us. Let's see. Oh, there it is. Okay. Thank you so very much for joining us. It looks like our technical support has provided that link to all of you. So you should all be able to access that at this time in your panel. And so thank you for joining us, and we look forward to you using this tool, sharing it with your colleagues, but moreover, hearing from you on the ways you're using it and any other feedback that you think could be helpful in improving the PPT in the future. You know, a lot of this process is driven by colleagues and, you know, just, you know, ground truthing it so it can be a realistic and reliable tool that can be helpful to all of you in your endeavors. So this concludes our webinar, and from all of us at AFT, please have a wonderful day.